Hi everybody, this is Katje. Welcome to my YouTube video channel. This evening I'm wearing a fall outfit, an early fall outfit, to celebrate the change in the seasons. We had some much needed rain today in the desert, which has cooled things down, so I wanted to dress appropriately for that occasion. This is a tube skirt that I've worn before, a striped tube skirt. I'm combining it with these knee-length leather boots and a few accessories that I have. So let me model that for you. Let me show you the boots, and here's the skirt from behind, and here it is from the side, from one side. Hi everybody, I hope you're doing well this evening, and here it is from the other side. So this is a very comfortable outfit, and it's really good for this time of year, so I wanted to show you that. And then this evening what I want to do is take a slight detour from what I've been talking about, although it is somewhat related to the Nietzschean themes I've been discussing, and I want to go back to one of my favorite artists whom I've mentioned before. This is the great artist Cy Twomby, who passed away a few years ago, and I want to talk about a particular painting of his, or actually it's an installation consisting of 10 paintings called 50 Days at Ilium. So this is Twomby's painterly treatment of the last 50 days of the Trojan War between the Greeks and the Trojans, and you can see it in the, I think it's on permanent exhibition in the Philadelphia Art Museum. There's an entire room devoted to 50 Days at Ilium, these 10 paintings. I will provide a link to a page from the Philadelphia Art Museum below this video, and on that page there's a slideshow that you can sort of go through and look at the various paintings. So just to give you an idea of how the installation is set up, basically it's in a large room, and the walls are covered with these 10 paintings. When you first come in, on either side of you there were paintings in which the Greek heroes are listed on one side and the Trojan heroes on the other. So you have people like Achilles and Agamemnon, and then you have Hector and Priam and Patroclus. And then as you proceed into the room, on the two main walls facing each other are these kind of abstract representations, or abstract treatments, I should say, depictions of the two armies, the Trojan army on the one wall, and then directly facing that on the other wall, the Greek army, where there are these abstract shapes and slashes and words for the various heroes in each one of those two armies. And so that's where the conflict is really, you sort of right in the middle of the conflict as you stand in the middle of the room. And then as you proceed through the room, there are other paintings that depict the wrath of Achilles and the fire that consumes all, very vividly colored canvases. They're really beautiful to look at. And then when you reach the end of the room, on one side there are the shades. There's a painting depicting the shades or the spirits of the slain Greek heroes. And on the other side there is a painting depicting the shades or the spirits of the slain Trojan heroes, and then you exit the room. So this is basically the way the whole thing is laid out. And it really is an extremely dramatic experience to walk into that room and to look at those paintings. It's very powerful. It's one of my favorite works of art. Now, what I want to say tonight is, what I want to try to do is explain what I think is a philosophical significance behind this, or one way of looking at it. And to begin to understand this, I think it's interesting to observe that the Trojans are backed by some of the gods, like Zeus and others. Actually, I think Zeus backs the Greeks. And then some of the other gods in the pantheon, the ancient pantheon, are backing the Trojans. So just as the Trojans and the Greeks are divided over against one another, so the gods on Olympus are divided against each other, some of them supporting the Trojans and some of them supporting the Greeks, the Achaeans. Now, what I find interesting about this is that we can also see something, or go back to something that Homer says, and Nietzsche actually quotes Homer on this, which is an interesting point. And Homer says something to the effect that, well, the Greeks and the Trojans, or the Achaeans and the Trojans, are all good. They're equally good. And that's true when you think about it, because when we look at the various heroes in the Iliad, and during this conflict, they all exemplify different virtues. They're the virtues of love, because Paris falls in love with Helen. That's what starts the entire war. There's the virtue of justice, because Agamemnon thinks he's pursuing justice because he feels that he's been wronged. He was supposed to marry Helen. There's the virtue of bravery. Certainly Hector and Achilles equally exemplify bravery, as well as the other heroes involved in the conflict. There's the virtue of loyalty. There's the virtue of patriotism, and so forth. And so what you have are all these virtues that these different sides are trying to realize, and it seems to me that the upshot of the work is that they can't all simultaneously be realized. It's impossible to equally to realize all of these virtues simultaneously. The result leads to a war in which the heroes on each side are killed. And so it leads to destruction, it leads to failure. It's a kind of a tragedy, as both Homer and I believe Nietzsche would also say. Now, what is the philosophical significance of this, or what might be a philosophical significance of it? And I think to understand this, it helps to go back to Plato's philosophy and think about that a little bit in connection with this painting. So Plato postulates that there are these forms. There are forms like the form of the good, and there also is the form of justice, there's the form of bravery, there's the form of love, and there are other forms that Plato does, the form of beauty, piety, other kinds of forms that Plato discusses in various dialogues, and each dialogue is dedicated to trying to define or discover the nature of one of these forms. And the idea is that all of these forms, including the form of the good, or maybe these are just different ways in which the form of the good is manifested, depending on which part of or phase of Plato's philosophy you consider. But the point is that all of these forms, all of these virtues, they don't exist on the earth. They don't exist in things, in people. They exist in a kind of abstract realm that sometimes is known as a Platonic heaven. So they're like abstract properties or abstract forms that exist in this Platonic heaven, and that different particulars or different human beings participate in without being identical to them. So the idea for Plato is, at least ideally, all of these forms can, in the ideal situation or in an ideal arrangement, they can coexist. Not just in a Platonic heaven, but they can also be coexist by being participated in equally by people on the earth, human beings, depending on what's in whatever station that they happen to find themselves. Now, it seems to me that what Twomby's painting suggests is that that's not possible. It's not possible for all of these virtues that are supposed to exist together in some Platonic heaven to be equally realized by participants on the earth, because we see an attempt to do that in 50 Days of Ilion, the last 50 days of the Trojan War, as it's depicted in this powerfully artistic way by Twomby. And the result is not some kind of utopia or some kind of heaven on earth where the Platonic forms are brought down from this kind of abstract realm into human life, and then all of them simultaneously and fully and perfectly realized. The attempt to do that leads to conflict, and it leads to war. Ultimately, it leads to the heroes on either side being killed. And I also think that the fact that Twomby, well, actually Homer originally, but certainly Twomby does justice to this in his painting. Homer sees the different sides, as I mentioned before, in the Trojan War, backed by different factions within the Olympian gods. And so there is this connection between a Platonic heaven, on the one hand, and divinity. You know, Homer makes it very clear that the gods are involved, but certainly there is a remnant or a whiff in Plato's philosophy of the divine, not only in some of the myths that he tells, but also in this notion of a Platonic heaven, where all of these Platonic forms are supposed to coexist, not in a way too unlike the gods are supposed to coexist in peace on Mount Olympus, except here it's much more abstract. The point, though, is that whether we're talking about the Greek gods who become embroiled in the Trojan War, or we're talking about Platonic forms that people try to equally participate in their lives, the result is not some kind of harmonious utopia. The result is a kind of strife, a kind of insurmountable conflict that leads to destruction. That makes it sound like the whole idea of there being these virtues that can be simultaneously instantiated or recognized is a myth, that there isn't any such thing. Either there aren't any such virtues like that, or even if they are in some Platonic heaven out there, they can never be fully realized in human life simultaneously, and that seems to be what Twomby is driving at, or at least implying, in his great work, 50 Days at Ilium. So I think that that's a significant result, and I think it would be congenial to what Nietzsche says, because he thinks that the whole notion of Platonic forms that we're supposed to somehow participate in is a metaphysical fiction that doesn't really have any relevance and can't really be made significant or important for human existence. I think that that's an attitude that you can take away from Twomby's work. He may not be saying that in so many words, but it certainly seems to be one permissible reading of what's going on there. And so I think there is a connection between this kind of Nietzschean skepticism about virtues and Platonic forms, and on the one hand, and Twomby's very vivid rendering of the Trojan War as an attempt for people to realize equally all of these different virtues, and yet the result is not some kind of harmony, but some kind of destructive conflict. So I think that's a very significant result. And finally, all of this ties in with something that I've been saying about morality in a kind of Nietzschean vein, which is that if we try to attain perfection through being perfectly moral, then for various reasons that we have discussed throughout the summer and some of my previous videos, that project is going to fail. It's going to fail because either we will find ourselves in situations where we will find ourselves in situations, or at least we conceivably could find ourselves in situations, various kinds of situations, where we cannot simultaneously realize all of these values. Either there will be some values that we are responsible for obeying, but we can't, or for some other reason we just can't, because when we try to do it, like in 50 Days at Ilium, the result is not harmony, but war and ultimately destruction. I think that's the artistic payoff, if you will, at least philosophical payoff, of what Twomby is doing in 50 Days at Ilium. So I leave that for your consideration. I hope that you find it interesting, and I do hope to get back to Nietzsche at some point and discuss the interrelations between his doctrine of the eternal recurrence, or the eternal return, and the will to power. That's a topic for a future video, but for now I think that's enough, and I thank you for joining me. As always, I wish everybody a peaceful and a restful and a safe good evening. Please be good to each other. Please take care of each other. Until next time, this is your cross-dressing friend Katje saying goodbye, and thank you again so much for your time and your patience. Bye-bye.